All right, today we're diving into British idealism, specifically the philosophy of Thomas Hill Green. We're going deep on this guy, unpacking excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Green. So consider this, I guess, your philosophical boot camp on Green.
I like that. Yeah, and you know what's fascinating about Green is he doesn't just like stay up in the clouds, with the abstract metaphysical concepts.
Right.
He actually applies them to real world issues, to like ethics and politics. So he was super engaged in social reform. He
Yeah.
really wanted to bridge that gap between, like heady philosophical thought and practical action, how we actually live.
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing a pattern here. It's like he's saying, okay, we figured out that reality is basically like mental. So now how do we use this knowledge to make society better? That's pretty radical for a 19th century philosopher, don't you think?
It is. It really is. And what's even more interesting is that, much of what we know about Green's philosophy actually comes from his students. They were so inspired by his lectures that they carefully collected and published his works after his death,
Wow.
which suggests that these ideas really resonated with the people who knew him best.
Yeah, that says a lot about the power of his ideas. I need to
Yeah.
have that kind of impact. Okay, before we get into the really, really mind-bending stuff, let's set the stage a little bit. Green was born in 1836, right?
Mhm.
Became a big name at Oxford and even, like, dipped his toes into Liberal Party politics.
Yeah.
But sadly, he died pretty young at 46.
Yeah, his life was cut tragically short. But even in that short time, his philosophical contributions were huge. He challenged the dominant empirical tradition in British philosophy and really paved the way for new ways of thinking about ethics, about politics, even the role of the state.
Okay, all right, let's get to the heart of it. Green's idealism. He was heavily influenced by Kant, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they both argued that reality isn't like this objective thing out there independent of our minds. It's actually shaped by our perception, by our understanding.
Exactly. Green, like Kant, rejected this idea that we can access things, quote unquote, in themselves. He argued that all we can ever know are appearances, right? How things appear to us through the lens of our own minds. Our minds are actively involved in structuring, in interpreting our experience of the world.
Yeah, for a philosopher, I feel like that's kind of intuitive.
Yeah.
But for someone who's just like dipping their toes into this, how would you explain that? How would you explain that idea?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine you're looking at a tree. You see its shape, its color, the texture of its bark.
Yeah.
Those are all appearances. They're mental representations constructed by your mind based on the sensory data that you're getting.
Okay.
But you can never actually grasp the essence of the tree in itself, only how it appears to your consciousness.
Okay, so it's not that the tree doesn't exist.
Right.
It's that our understanding of it is always like mediated by our minds.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but Green, he takes us a step further, right? With his concept of eternal consciousness.
Yes, this is where Green's idealism gets really complex and frankly a bit mind-bending, even for philosophers.
Right.
So he posits this single universal consciousness, a kind of cosmic mind, you could say, of which our individual minds are just like little fragments.
Cosmic mind.
A cosmic mind.
So we're all connected to this giant universal consciousness. That's a pretty big concept to wrap your head around. What led him to that conclusion?
Well, Green had a few reasons, for proposing this idea. He was concerned about the implications of subjective idealism, right? Where truth becomes totally relative to the individual.
Yes.
He thought this would lead to a kind of philosophical anarchy where there's no shared ground for knowledge or even for morality.
So he's searching for a way to ground objectivity, but not in the traditional sense of like an external mind-independent reality.
Exactly. He finds that grounding in this eternal consciousness, it acts as a unifying principle. It's like a source of shared understanding that goes beyond, that transcends our individual perspectives. And this allows for the possibility of objective truth, of moral values, even though they're ultimately grounded in consciousness rather than in a material world.
I see. I see how that works.
Yeah.
So the eternal consciousness becomes the bedrock for both knowledge and ethics. And it avoids the pitfalls of pure subjectivism, while still acknowledging that the mind plays an active role in shaping reality. But doesn't this raise some issues? Like, what about the uniqueness of individual experience? Does that just get lost in this grand scheme of a universal consciousness?
That's a great question, and it's one that Green himself grappled with, for sure. It does raise this question of how much autonomy individual consciousness has within this larger framework. Does the eternal consciousness determine our thoughts? Does it determine our actions? Or do we have genuine freedom of will?
And how does the concept of free will, which is so central to our moral and ethical frameworks, fit into this idea of a universal consciousness? That seems like a pretty important piece of the puzzle.
It is. It's one of the most intriguing and challenging aspects of Green's philosophy. It compels us to think deeply about this relationship between the universal and the particular, between the shared ground of our being and the unique expressions of individual consciousness.
Right.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
It really is complicated. And, it leads us right into Green's ethical theories, which are like really closely tied to his idealism. One of the things I find really interesting about Green is his rejection of simple hedonism, like the idea that pleasure is the be-all and end-all of life.
Right, so he's saying there's more to life than just chasing those fleeting pleasures, which I find, I don't know, kind of refreshing, especially in a world that often seems so obsessed with instant gratification. Like, give it to me now.
Absolutely, yeah. For Green, the real good, the true good, lies in self-realization. It's about cultivating our capacities as rational, as moral beings, striving to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. It's about aligning our actions with what we understand is truly valuable and meaningful.
So it's not about seeking pleasure just for the sake of it, but it's about, pursuing goals that contribute to our growth as individuals.
Yeah.
Living a life that's both fulfilling and morally sound.
Yeah, exactly. But Green doesn't stop there. He connects this idea of self-realization to a wider social context. He argues that we can only truly fully realize ourselves within a community, within a structure of shared values and goals.
Okay, so our individual striving for self-realization is somehow bound up with the well-being of others. It's not just about like individual growth, but about, I guess, contributing to a larger social good.
Exactly. And what's kind of remarkable, I think, is that Green extends this idea of the common good to include, all of humanity. He imagines this world where everyone flourishes not just in isolation, but as a part of this like global community striving toward a shared ideal.
Wow, that's a pretty radical vision for the 19th century. I mean, it seems to almost foreshadow a lot of contemporary ideas about global citizenship and the fact that we're all interconnected.
Yeah.
But it also raises a question. I mean, how does Green reconcile this focus on the common good with individual freedom? Doesn't the pursuit of some collective ideal kind of risk infringing on individual liberties?
That is a really important question, and it's one that Green definitely thought about and addressed very directly. He actually makes a distinction between three types of freedom: juridical freedom, moral freedom, and real freedom. So juridical freedom is the simplest one. It's just the absence of external constraints, right? Meaning you're not legally prevented from doing something.
Okay, so that's like the basic freedom from interference, the kind that's enshrined in, a lot of our legal systems.
Right, exactly. Then you have moral freedom, which is more about the capacity to make choices based on reason, based on moral principles, rather than just impulse or desire. It's about having the ability to choose what's right, even when it's hard.
So moral freedom requires a certain amount of self-awareness
Right.
and moral development. It's about being able to act in accordance with your values.
Absolutely. But both juridical and moral freedom, in Green's view, are basically stepping stones to what he calls real freedom.
And what does real freedom actually look like in this framework, in Green's view?
Well, real freedom for Green is living in alignment with your true, rational self, making choices that contribute to both your own self-realization and the common good. It's about recognizing that your individual flourishing is totally linked to the well-being of others.
This is not just about, having the freedom to do whatever you want, but about having the wisdom, I guess, and the moral compass to choose what's truly good, not just for you, but for the community as well.
Yeah, you got it. And this is where things get really interesting, especially when we think about the kind of tension that's built into Green's concept of real freedom. He seems to be saying that there are choices we can make that, might be considered free in the juridical sense or even the moral sense, but that wouldn't be real freedom because they don't help us grow or contribute to the common good.
Right. It's almost like there's a hierarchy of choices in his mind. Some are more free than others, even if they're all technically allowed.
That's a really good way to put it. He's definitely challenging this traditional view of freedom as just the absence of restrictions. Green's really pushing us to think more deeply about what it truly means to live a free and a meaningful life.
He is. And that leads to even bigger questions, right? About what role should the state play in promoting both individual freedom and this common good? Because if real freedom requires, a certain level of moral and intellectual development, does the state have a responsibility to cultivate those qualities in its citizens? Does it even have the right to step in, to intervene in people's lives and try to, help them make better choices, even if those choices don't directly harm anyone else.
Those are huge questions, and they're questions that we're still grappling with today. As we debate the role of government and social welfare programs in regulating the economy and protecting individual rights.
Yeah, Green's philosophy really gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it? It seems like he's a far cry from that laissez-faire liberalism that was so popular in the 19th century. The idea that the government should just stay out of people's lives.
He really is. Green's offering this much more nuanced and complex view of the relationship between the individual and the state, one that sees individual freedom and social responsibility as totally intertwined.
And his concept of real freedom is so central to that, isn't it? The idea that true freedom isn't just about doing whatever you want, but about our ability to make choices that actually make the world a better place.
Exactly, yeah. And that takes us right into Green's political philosophy, where all these ideas about freedom, self-realization, and the common good start to take shape in the real world.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and explore how Green's ideas actually translate into concrete political action.
Hmm.
Right, so let's paint the scene here. It's 19th century England and things aren't exactly, sunshine and roses. Child labor is rampant. There's poverty everywhere. Very few people have access to education. It's a pretty grim reality. And Green, he couldn't ignore it. So how does that address these problems?
Well, Green's philosophy really provided a strong justification for the government to get more involved, to be more active in solving these social problems. He argued that the state had a moral obligation to, create the conditions where people could actually achieve self-realization and contribute to the common good. So that meant tackling things like poverty, lack of education, unfair working conditions, all these things that were preventing people from living truly free and fulfilling lives.
Okay, so he's definitely not going for that hands-off approach, that laissez-faire kind of thing. He actually sees the state as having a positive role to play in creating a more just and fair society.
Yeah, exactly. Green believed that true freedom requires more than just the absence of those external constraints. It also requires access to resources, to opportunities that allow people to develop their potential, to actually contribute to society. And he saw the state as having a crucial role in making sure those conditions exist for everybody.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
He's saying that freedom without opportunity is kind of a meaningless promise. But didn't this more interventionist approach raise some red flags? People worried about the government overreaching, about it infringing on individual liberty, right?
Oh, for sure. Those concerns were definitely there. Green was very aware of the dangers of, the state becoming too paternalistic, encroaching on individual autonomy in the name of some kind of collective good. It's a tough balance. He grappled with that tension throughout his work, trying to find that sweet spot between individual freedom and social responsibility.
So how did he navigate that tension? What kind of role did he see for the state ultimately?
Well, he saw the state's role as mainly enabling, not dictating. He thought the state should focus on creating the conditions for individuals to flourish, providing education, healthcare, economic opportunities, but at the same time still respecting individual choices and freedoms. So, for example, he supported compulsory education, not to indoctrinate people, but to give them the knowledge and skills they need to achieve self-realization, to participate in society in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it sounds like he's really trying to find that balance where the state supports individual growth without dictating what that growth should look like. It's a tough needle to thread, I imagine.
It really is. And honestly, it's a debate that's still going on today. We're still wrestling with these questions about how much the government should be involved in social welfare, in regulating the economy, and, protecting individual rights.
For sure. I mean, Green's philosophy really gives us a lot to think about. It shows us that the pursuit of knowledge isn't just some abstract intellectual exercise. It's actually a deeply ethical and practical thing, something that can actually help us create a more just and fulfilling world.
I totally agree. Green's philosophy is this really powerful call to action. It challenges us to think critically about the world, to live ethically, and to really engage in shaping a society that reflects our highest ideals. And I think ultimately that's a challenge that's worth taking on.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of Thomas Hill Green. It's clear that he was a brilliant and insightful thinker, and his ideas are just as relevant today as they were back in the 19th century. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it too.